Hi.
When I asked him for a massage that night, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was an innocent request, my back hurt, I'd been carrying too many bags from the store, and my husband hadn't touched me in weeks, except maybe a quick pat on the shoulder in passing. But when his hands touched my shoulders, the air in the room changed. Something shifted. It wasn't like the massages at the spa, or the way my husband used to rub my neck years ago. It felt like something else, careful, yes, but almost too careful, as if he was afraid to go too far but also didn't want to stop. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining the warmth in his touch. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. When I turned around and saw his eyes, that startled mix of hesitation and something unnamed, my heart skipped a beat. Not the way it did when I was caught doing something wrong, but the way it does when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband's steady breathing next to me like an anchor I couldn't feel anymore. I kept telling myself, it was just a massage. But I already knew. That was the beginning of everything. The thing I'd never planned, never wanted, and couldn't stop once it started. 3 months later, it would change everything, and now I have to tell you how it really happened. But before I share the secret I've tried so hard to bury, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer me honestly, have you ever asked for something so simple, only to realize later it would ruin everything? I didn't wake up that morning thinking my life was about to shift in ways I couldn't reverse. It was just another gray, ordinary day, the kind of day where coffee tasted a little too bitter and my husband's voice sounded a little too distant. He was already dressed when I came into the kitchen, scrolling through emails on his phone, his plate empty but still sitting on the table, as if even cleaning up after himself was too much effort these days. I poured myself coffee, feeling that familiar hollowness in the air between us. We weren't fighting. That was the strangest part, there was no screaming, no sharp words, no slammed doors. Just the quiet kind of neglect that seeps in over years, like water leaking through the roof, warping the wood without anyone noticing until it's too late. I told myself I should be grateful. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful, as far as I knew. He just wasn't there. His body sat at our table, his voice answered my questions, but his mind lived somewhere else, in his work, his meetings, the endless obligations that pulled him further from me. And I had stopped reaching for him because every time I tried, his response felt perfunctory, like checking a box on a to-do list. I had stopped wearing the dresses he once complimented. I had stopped bothering to light candles at dinner. Because when you're ignored long enough, you stop calling attention to the void. That afternoon, he called to say he'd be home late again. He said it the way you say, it might rain later. No apology, no pause, just a fact. I nodded into the phone even though he couldn't see me, and when I hung up, the silence in the house felt heavier than usual. That's when I heard the door open. It was him, not my husband, but my stepson. He wasn't supposed to be here for long, just a few days to help with the house. A faucet needed fixing, a shelf had to be reinforced, and my husband had said, he's young, he's strong, he can handle it. I hadn't objected. I liked having another presence in the house, a voice that didn't sound perpetually distracted. He came into the kitchen, shaking off the rain from his jacket, and smiled at me in that open, unguarded way my husband hadn't in years. Need any help? He asked, looking at the groceries still in bags on the counter. I almost said no. But then I saw the weight of the larger bag, and I thought about how much my back ached from carrying it up the stairs. Actually, I said, yes. It was such an ordinary moment. He took the bag from me, his fingers brushing mine as he did. I didn't think much of it at first, but later, lying in bed, I would remember that exact brush of skin like an electric spark. He moved easily around the kitchen, putting things away without being asked where they belonged. He didn't hover, didn't make a fuss, didn't fill the air with empty chatter. Just small, simple things, sliding the heavy jar of flour into the cupboard, making sure the bag of apples didn't bruise when he set them down. And for some reason, those gestures cut me in a way I couldn't explain. They were the kind of small kindnesses my husband used to give me without thinking, pulling out a chair, holding open a door, but they had been absent so long I'd stopped noticing their absence. Until someone else brought them back. That night I tried to tell myself it meant nothing. People help each other, that's all. He was just being polite. But as I lay in the dark, listening to the soft hum of rain against the window, I felt something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was awareness. Awareness of how long I had been moving through life half asleep, and how easily one unexpected gesture could wake me. The next day, my husband called again to say he'd be working late. His voice sounded almost impatient, like he didn't understand why I even needed to know. I hung up before the silence could turn into resentment. My back hurt again, from lifting, from bending, from the weight of everything I didn't say. And before I could stop myself, I turned to him, the one person in the house who actually looked at me, and I asked the question that would undo everything. Would you mind giving me a massage? I don't know why I phrased it like that, as if asking for something so simple required an apology. Maybe because my husband hadn't touched me like that in so long that asking him would have felt absurd. He didn't hesitate. Of course, he said, as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing. When his hands touched my shoulders, I expected relief. What I didn't expect was the warmth, the way his thumbs pressed carefully into the muscles, the way his hands steadied, almost reverent. At first, I told myself, this is fine, this is harmless, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to believe my own words. Later, I would stare at the ceiling, listening to the rain, my husband's steady breathing next to me. I would replay the weight of those hands, the way my skin had responded, the way my thoughts had raced, and I would whisper into the dark, it was just a massage. But even then, I knew I was lying. The morning after that massage, I moved through the house differently. At first, I told myself nothing had changed, the same coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, the same creak in the hallway step caught my heel, the same gray light filtered through the curtains. But everything felt louder somehow, sharper, as if someone had turned the world's volume knob up one notch. I noticed the way his footsteps sounded on the stairs, even though they'd been sounding that way for days. I noticed the smell of his shampoo when he walked past me in the kitchen, clean, a little citrus, something that didn't belong to this house. I noticed my own hands as I held the coffee mug. I could almost feel the echo of his touch from the night before still humming under my skin. I wanted to believe that what happened had been harmless. I repeated that word to myself as I buttered toast, as I rinsed the plates, as I folded laundry. Harmless, but my body didn't feel harmless, and neither did my thoughts. When he walked into the kitchen, I caught myself straightening my robe without thinking. It wasn't revealing, just cotton and long sleeves, but suddenly I was aware of how it sat on me, how the belt tied at my waist. I hated myself for the flicker of thought that whispered, would he notice if I wore something else? He was casual, almost oblivious. He asked if there was anything I needed done that day. I shook my head too quickly, then added, maybe the loose shelf in the laundry room. I almost added, and maybe you could look at me like you did last night, but of course I didn't. The massage hadn't been passionate. It hadn't been inappropriate, not in any obvious way. But there had been something in it, something that crossed a line that neither of us named. And once you cross a line, it doesn't matter how quietly you step over it, the fact remains that you're on the other side now. By midday, I couldn't stand the weight of the walls. I needed air, an errand, a reason to leave. I should get groceries, I said aloud, mostly to myself. He looked up from the shelf he was fixing and asked, do you want company? I hesitated, but not for long enough. Sure. The drive into town was uneventful in the way that feels like it's pretending not to be. The radio played softly, something from the 80s I half remembered. The windshield wipers scraped at a light drizzle, and every time they paused, the silence in the car seemed to expand. We talked about nothing. The weather. How expensive gas had gotten. How the shelf was finally steady. But under the words, there was that undercurrent, the memory of last night's hands on my shoulders, and the knowledge that neither of us had mentioned it. At the store, the fluorescent lights were too bright, the aisles too narrow. I pushed the cart while he grabbed the heavier things, bags of flour, a sack of potatoes. Our hands brushed when we both reached for the same loaf of bread, and I laughed, too quickly, too lightly. There was a moment in the produce aisle when I saw someone from down the street. She smiled, waved, and looked from me to him and back again. Her smile didn't mean anything, but my stomach still clenched. Suddenly, I was hyper-aware of how we looked together. Not guilty, not intimate, just together. When we loaded the bags into the trunk, the rain picked up, misting our faces. He took the heaviest ones without asking, and when his hand brushed mine again, I didn't pull away. The drive back was quieter. The radio stayed off this time, and the only sound was the tires hissing on wet pavement. I stared out the window, watching water slide down the glass, and tried not to think about how much I wanted to look at him. Back at the house, we unloaded the groceries. He stacked the pantry neatly, and I realized my husband hadn't done that in years, not because he couldn't, but because he never thought to. That evening, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I lingered at the mirror. I brushed my hair a little longer, adjusted the collar of my blouse twice. When I saw my reflection, I didn't quite recognize the expression on my face, a mix of unease and something that almost looked like anticipation. He was sitting at the table later, fixing something small, a squeaky hinge maybe, I don't even remember. I walked past him, close enough that the fabric of my sleeve brushed his shoulder. He looked up, startled, and our eyes met. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. I should have walked away. I should have said something mundane, like dinner's ready, or the mail came. But I didn't. I stopped. He stood. And then, we kissed. There was no prelude, no build-up of words. Just the weight of everything we hadn't said collapsing into one brief, reckless moment. We broke apart almost instantly, the air between us sharp with panic. I heard my own voice, thin and shaky, that shouldn't have happened. He didn't answer, not with words. He just looked at me, wide-eyed, as if he was waiting for me to decide what it meant. I turned away before I could decide. My hands shook as I reached for the dish towel, for anything to do, anything to anchor me. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling again. But this time, there was no lie I could tell myself, no harmless word to cling to. Because we had kissed. And nothing about it felt harmless. The next day felt like walking on a frozen lake, unsure which step would crack the ice beneath me. Everything looked the same, the sunlight spilling through the blinds, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, but there was a tension in the air so thick it felt almost visible, a shimmer you could nearly touch. I moved through the room slowly, as if I were afraid to bump into anything, and set off an alarm no one had installed. I avoided looking at him for the first hour we were awake. He was in the living room, fiddling with a loose drawer handle, while I busied myself in the kitchen, reorganizing the pantry just to have something to do. Every sound seemed amplified, the scrape of a chair on tile, the click of a drawer closing, even the kettle whistling made me jump. I kept telling myself to act normal, but normal felt foreign. There was no script for this. I didn't even know what normal would look like anymore. When I finally glanced toward the living room, I saw him look up at the same time. Our eyes met for less than a second, but it was long enough for me to see it, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had happened, and neither of us knew what to do with it. He was calm in a way that made me restless. He didn't flinch, didn't fidget, didn't act guilty or nervous. Maybe that should have comforted me, but it didn't. Instead, it made me feel even more aware of my own unease, my own darting glances, my own attempts to keep my hands from trembling when I poured my tea. Around midday, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "I need to go into town," I said, louder than necessary, as if announcing it would make it sound more ordinary. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame casually, but his eyes were sharp. "Do you want me to come?" The pause before my answer felt too long, but eventually, I nodded. "Sure." The drive started off stiff, the air between us like static. The road was wet from last night's rain, and the tires hissed over the pavement. The windshield wipers kept time like an impatient metronome. We spoke about small things, how cold the weather had turned, how the neighbor's dog barked all night again, but every word seemed to bounce off something invisible, as though the conversation skimmed the surface of a deeper, heavier truth neither of us dared touch. When we reached the supermarket, the lights were too bright and the colors too harsh. I clung to the shopping list in my hand like it was a map out of this mess, though I knew it wasn't. We moved through the aisles in quiet coordination, a rhythm that would have seemed ordinary to anyone watching. He picked up the heavier items without me asking, slid jars into the cart with care, held the cart steady when I reached for the higher shelf. All so simple. All so easy to dismiss. But I noticed everything. I noticed the way his hand brushed mine when we both reached for the same box of tea, how neither of us pulled away as quickly as we should have. I noticed the way he watched me for a second longer than necessary when I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. I noticed the woman in the frozen foods aisle who glanced at us twice. She didn't say anything, didn't smirk or raise an eyebrow, but the second glance was enough to make my stomach twist. We loaded the bags into the car under a gray sky, the air damp with drizzle. He lifted the heaviest ones into the trunk like it was nothing, and when I handed him a bag, our fingers met again. This time, there wasn't even a brush, it was more like a hold, brief and fleeting, but a hold all the same. On the drive back, neither of us spoke much. The radio stayed off. The sound of the engine filled the space where words might have been, and I stared out the window, my breath leaving faint fog on the glass. Back at the house, we carried the bags inside. He put things away methodically, stacking the pantry neatly, wiping condensation from the milk before sliding it into the fridge. The details stood out in sharp relief, maybe because I'd been starved of them for so long. My husband used to be like that, careful, attentive, present. But now, he tossed things onto shelves without looking, too distracted to notice when a jar fell over. I felt that awful mix of gratitude and guilt growing in my chest. Gratitude for the kindness. Guilt for noticing it at all. The afternoon stretched on like an elastic band pulled too tight. Every moment was a test of patience, of restraint, of pretending. By early evening, the house felt stifling again. I walked past him in the hallway, closer than I needed to. Our sleeves brushed. That single touch felt louder than words. He looked up, surprised, and for an instant, neither of us moved. I should have said something ordinary, asked about dinner, mentioned the mail, anything. Instead, I stopped walking. He stood straighter. The space between us shrank in a breath, and the look in his eyes wasn't hesitant, but it wasn't bold either. It was somewhere in between, a silent question neither of us voiced. And for the second time, I didn't think. We kissed again. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't long. Just one sharp, undeniable moment that broke the thin layer of denial we'd both been clinging to. When we pulled back, my chest tightened. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, in my throat, in the space where our mouths had just been. I muttered something, maybe this shouldn't happen, maybe nothing at all. My voice sounded unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else entirely. He didn't reply, but his silence said enough. I turned away, my steps unsteady, my breath uneven. That night, when my husband came home, I smiled the same smile I always did, cooked the same dinner I always cooked, listened to him talk about his day like I always had. But when I lay down in bed, staring at the ceiling, the truth sat heavy on my chest. We had kissed. Again. And every time it happened, it felt less like a mistake I could erase and more like a path I couldn't turn away from. The morning after that second kiss, the house felt like a stage where every piece of furniture, every sound, and every gesture could betray me. Nothing had been said about it, not a word, but the air itself seemed to remember. Even the silence was heavier, like it carried the weight of what we hadn't dared to talk about. I stood at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into my cup, and felt the tremor in my hands as the liquid sloshed too close to the rim. I told myself to breathe, to move slowly, to just keep going as though nothing had happened. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every small task, rinsing fruit, folding a dish towel, even opening a cupboard, seemed to carry meaning it shouldn't have. When he walked in, I didn't look up right away. I couldn't. Instead, I stared into the steam rising from my mug as if there was an answer in it. His footsteps were steady, the same as always, but now they made my pulse quicken. He greeted me casually, his voice calm, almost light, and that calmness unsettled me even more. It wasn't indifference, it was the kind of calm that held something back. I thought about saying something, some casual, meaningless remark about the weather, about what we needed from the store, about anything, but nothing left my mouth. I just nodded when he mentioned the shelf he'd fixed the night before, pretending my throat wasn't too tight to speak properly. My husband called mid-morning, and for a moment I felt a flood of relief, like his voice through the phone might tether me back to who I was supposed to be. He talked about his work schedule, about meetings running late again, and I found myself murmuring answers, my voice automatic. When he hung up, the relief didn't last. The house sank back into its strange, thick quiet, and the tether frayed again. I decided to distract myself with chores, something mundane to keep my thoughts from circling. I asked him to help move the furniture in the living room, telling myself it was a practical request. "It's too heavy for me," I said, and it wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He agreed easily, and we started moving things around, pushing the couch a few inches to the left, lifting the edge of the rug to straighten it, shifting the coffee table. It was nothing intimate, nothing charged on the surface, but every time our hands got too close, every time our shoulders brushed, I felt that familiar jolt. At one point, we both reached for the same side of the cabinet. His hand overlapped mine for half a second, and neither of us moved right away. It was so small, so fleeting, but it burned into my awareness like a brand. I told myself I needed space, and I stepped back too quickly, almost knocking over the lamp behind me. He caught it before it fell, his reflexes quick, and the moment should have been funny, something we could laugh about, but it wasn't. We didn't laugh. The rest of the day unfolded in fragments. He went back to small repairs and household tasks. I pretended to read the newspaper, staring at the same paragraph without taking in a word. Each time I passed him in the hallway, I found myself holding my breath, as if even breathing too close might break the fragile balance we were barely holding. In the late afternoon, my husband called again to say he'd be home later than planned. His voice was as matter-of-fact as always, but this time, the news didn't bring relief. Instead, it felt like something in me cracked open further. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror after the call ended, gripping the edge of the sink. I studied my own face, the faint lines at the corners of my eyes, the smudge of lipstick from this morning that had faded unevenly. I wondered if I looked different now, if anyone could see it, that shift inside me, that new, dangerous awareness. By evening, the tension had settled in like another presence in the house. I cooked dinner, though I couldn't remember tasting it. He passed me the salt without being asked, held a plate steady while I served. Our fingers brushed again, and I flinched this time, not because I didn't want the touch, but because I did. We ate mostly in silence. The clink of forks against plates sounded too loud, too deliberate. I couldn't stop glancing at him, then forcing my eyes away when he noticed. Later, when the dishes were done and the kitchen lights dimmed, I sat in the living room pretending to look through a magazine. He came in carrying a box of tools, setting it down near the wall where a loose hinge still needed fixing. The small, domestic scene should have been harmless, almost dull. But it wasn't. He crouched to work, his focus steady, his movements calm. And I sat there, acutely aware of every sound, the soft thud of the hammer, the scrape of metal, even his breath when he exhaled. At one point, he looked up, just briefly. Our eyes met again. It wasn't a long look, not lingering, but it held something we both understood and neither of us named. I told myself I needed to end the day, to retreat to the safety of my bedroom, to put walls, literal and metaphorical, back between us. But as I turned to go, I felt his presence behind me, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. I reached the hallway and paused. My hand rested on the doorframe, and I realized I was holding my breath again. When I finally made it to my room and shut the door, I leaned against it, feeling the wood press into my back. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, still, as the weight of everything sank in. 2 kisses. 2 lines crossed. And the terrifying knowledge that each step seemed to make the next one easier to take. The next day dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that makes you feel the weight of your own thoughts more sharply. I woke up early, long before my husband stirred beside me, and stared at the ceiling as the early light crept across it. My chest felt tight, like someone had placed a stone on it overnight. 2 kisses had already happened, and I could pretend for only so long that they were isolated, accidental moments. They weren't. They were steps, quiet, irreversible steps down a path I hadn't admitted I was on. I moved carefully through the morning, almost theatrically careful, as if exaggerated normalcy could erase the tension. I brewed coffee and set 2 mugs on the counter, one for myself, one for my husband, even though I knew he would take his and disappear into his office as he always did. When he did come into the kitchen, still half asleep, he kissed me absently on the cheek, the same way someone might pat a dog's head before heading out the door. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't unkind. But it wasn't connection either, and it left me feeling hollow in a way I didn't want to dwell on. He left for work, and the house went quiet again, too quiet. I heard him moving upstairs, his steps steady, unhurried. He came down with a folded sheet and asked if I wanted it stored away in the linen closet. His voice was as calm as ever, but I felt the undertone, or maybe I was just imagining it. Every word between us now felt loaded, even the simplest ones. It rained again that afternoon, the kind of soft rain that lingers for hours, tapping on the windows like it's reminding you you're stuck inside. My back ached from lifting bags the day before, and I caught myself rubbing the same spot on my shoulder over and over, my thumb pressing into the knot of muscle as if that would somehow loosen it. And then, before I could stop myself, I said it. My back hurts again. He looked at me, the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes, and asked, "Do you want me to help?" I should have said no. I should have laughed and brushed it off and said, "It's nothing, I'll be fine." But I didn't. "Yes," I said instead. The word was soft, almost hesitant, but it was enough. We were in the living room again. The rain outside filled the silence, a steady, patient rhythm. I sat down, and he stood behind me, his hands hesitating for the briefest moment before they touched my shoulders. The first press of his thumbs sent a shiver through me, not from pain, but from the simple fact of being touched. It was careful, measured, but there was warmth in it. Not passion. Not seduction. Just warmth. But that warmth felt like fire against skin that had been cold too long. I told myself to relax, to keep this in the realm of innocent. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to hold that line. His hands were steady, but they weren't detached. They carried intention, not overt, not spoken, but there. I felt my breath deepen without meaning to. My shoulders slackened under his palms, and for a moment, I let myself imagine what it would feel like if this wasn't complicated, if I could just accept the touch without the weight of guilt pressing in on me. But it was complicated. I shifted slightly, and when I looked up, our eyes met. It happened too quickly to stop. We kissed. Again. This one was different, though. The other kisses had been sharp, almost panicked, like we were tripping into them. This one was slower, heavier. It wasn't longer, but it felt fuller somehow, like we both understood exactly what it meant. I pulled back first, my breath unsteady. My hand went to my mouth instinctively, like I could somehow erase the feeling with my fingertips. This shouldn't happen, I said, my voice too quiet, almost a whisper. The words sounded weak, not because I didn't mean them, but because they weren't enough to carry the weight of what I was feeling. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He didn't say anything at all. I stood up quickly, the chair scraping the floor too loudly. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, irregular rhythm. And then, like the universe was conspiring to remind me of the world outside this moment, there was a knock on the door. I froze. It was the neighbor. She stood there with an apologetic smile, holding an empty jar. "Do you have any sugar I could borrow?" she asked. I handed it to her with hands that trembled, praying she couldn't see the flush in my cheeks or hear the unevenness in my breath. When she left, the silence in the house returned, heavier than before. I avoided his eyes for the rest of the evening. I busied myself with dishes, with folding laundry that didn't need folding, with anything that kept my hands moving. But no matter what I did, the thought kept circling, insistent and sharp. We had kissed. Again. And this time, the kiss hadn't felt like an accident. It had felt like a choice. The morning after that third kiss, I woke before the alarm. It wasn't a peaceful waking. It was the kind where your mind is already running before your eyes even open. The room was dim, but my thoughts were loud. They crowded me, pushed against me, whispering what I didn't want to face. 3 kisses now. 3. Each one easier than the last. Each one leaving me more unsure of who I was, or maybe more sure of who I was becoming. I turned my head toward my husband sleeping next to me. His face looked calm, his breathing even, and for a moment, I felt a stab of something that was almost anger but mostly sorrow. He looked like someone I used to know well. He looked like someone I still wanted to know, but couldn't seem to reach. The pillow between us felt like a wall, not a cushion. I slid out of bed quietly, moving like someone avoiding cracks in the floorboards. In the kitchen, I tried to lose myself in routine, measuring coffee grounds, slicing bread, spreading butter too neatly, as if precision could anchor me. But the motions felt hollow. My mind wasn't in the kitchen. When he walked in, his footsteps steady, it startled me even though I had been listening for them. I kept my eyes down, staring at the knife in my hand as I cut fruit, aware of how ridiculous it felt to be so aware of every movement, every sound. "Morning," he said. His voice was calm. Always calm. I managed a morning back, though it sounded smaller than I intended. The whole day stretched ahead of me like an obstacle course I didn't know how to get through. My husband was leaving for work soon, he'd already mentioned it last night, and that thought was both relief and dread. Relief because the silence between me and him, the other him, wouldn't have to be carefully measured for a few hours. Dread because I knew what being alone in the house again could lead to. When my husband left, the door closing behind him felt louder than it should have. The house settled. He was in the other room, fixing something again, the steady sound of tools tapping and scraping a background to my restless pacing. I told myself I needed to stay busy. I scrubbed the kitchen counters even though they didn't need scrubbing. I watered a plant that wasn't thirsty. I folded towels twice. But nothing distracted me from the tension. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't stormy. It was quiet and steady, like a drip of water you can't ignore no matter how small the sound. In the early afternoon, I was in the kitchen when he came in holding a cracked picture frame, asking where the glue was. He stood close, too close, though not close enough to be inappropriate. Close enough that I could smell the rain in his clothes, the faint soap scent on his hands. I told him where the glue was, pointing toward the drawer, but my hand shook just slightly as I gestured. I hoped he didn't notice. The rain outside hadn't stopped, only softened into a drizzle that felt endless. It pressed against the windows, making the inside of the house feel smaller, more enclosed. I dropped a glass. It slipped from my wet hand and hit the tile, shattering into sharp pieces that scattered across the floor. The sound was so loud it made me flinch. He was there in an instant, crouching beside me. "Don't move," he said, reaching for the larger shards. I knelt anyway, reaching for the smaller pieces, but my fingers shook. Our hands touched, accidentally, unintentionally, over the same fragment. It should have been nothing. A shared task. Helping. But the touch lingered a fraction too long. I felt the warmth of his hand through my skin, the weight of the moment pressing down like a warning I couldn't quite heed. I pulled my hand back too quickly, nicking my finger on an edge. It wasn't serious, just a small sting, a tiny bead of red. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, too fast. "It's nothing." He went to get a bandage anyway. When he came back, he wrapped it carefully around my finger, his hand steady while mine trembled. That simple act, someone tending to a tiny hurt, felt like more intimacy than I'd had in months. I hated that it mattered. I hated that it felt like something. By evening, the house had that same thick quiet again, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I stood in front of the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, my reflection staring back at me. I thought about the kisses, about how easily they had happened, about how easily they could happen again. I thought about my husband's voice on the phone last night, distant but steady. And I thought about the space between what I was supposed to feel and what I actually felt, a space that seemed wider every day. Later, when I heard his footsteps behind me, I didn't turn immediately. I stood there, still, watching my own faint outline in the window as if that reflection might offer answers. It didn't. I turned around. He was standing there, a few feet away. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, dense, pressing. I stepped back, forcing a breath out slowly, and told myself to stop, to retreat, to let the quiet stand between us. But in that moment, I knew the truth. The distance between what had already happened and what might happen next was shrinking, and there was nothing left in me that truly believed I could stop it. The night it finally happened started like any other, and that was the part that unsettled me the most. There was no clear warning, no sharp change in the air, just the same slow rhythm of a house that had learned to live in quiet. I woke early, made coffee, and tried to steady my breathing as I watched steam curl from the mug. The day stretched long and gray, each hour blurring into the next, each task done carefully, almost mechanically. My husband had already left by the time I came downstairs, his brief "I'll be late again" echoing in my head long after the door shut. He said it the same way someone might mention they'd forgotten their umbrella, an afterthought. It didn't sting like a fresh wound anymore. It was more like an ache I'd grown accustomed to, dull but constant. The house belonged to its sounds that day, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tap of rain on the windows, the creak of floorboards when I moved through the hallway. And his footsteps. Always his footsteps. Measured. Steady. They made my heart jump even when I wasn't looking for him. I told myself to keep busy, to fill the day with chores. I vacuumed even though the carpet didn't need it. I wiped already clean counters. I folded sheets that were already folded. Every action felt like stalling, as if I were buying time from something I couldn't name out loud. By late afternoon, the rain hadn't stopped, only softened into a mist that made the windows look like frosted glass. The air inside felt thicker, heavier, as if the weather had seeped into the walls. He came into the kitchen carrying an empty cup, asked if there was any coffee left. His voice was casual, but the sound of it seemed to settle into me like warmth spreading through cold skin. We spoke a little, about nothing that mattered. He mentioned fixing the loose drawer in the bathroom. I mentioned needing to go through the pantry. But each word felt weighted, as if even these small exchanges carried more than they should. When evening came, the house went quiet in a way that made me hyper-aware of every breath, every shift of fabric, every step. I heard my husband's voice on the phone just before dinner. He wasn't coming home. Another late night, he said. Of course, I said. We both spoke like it was routine, because it was. When I hung up, the silence was louder than the call had been. The sun went down early, the way it does in heavy weather, and the house took on that dim, in-between light that makes every room feel smaller. I made dinner but barely tasted it. He helped, wordlessly passing plates, holding the pot steady while I ladled soup. Our hands brushed twice, and each time it was brief but unmistakable. After the dishes were done, the evening stretched on, too long, too still. I sat in the living room with a book I didn't read. The words blurred, and I stared at the same sentence until it stopped meaning anything. He walked in quietly, sat at the edge of the armchair across from me. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The room felt suspended. The rain, the ticking clock, the hum of the lamp, they were the only sounds, and they felt louder than conversation would have. I put the book down. He looked up. There was nothing dramatic about it. No sudden lunge, no confession. Just a quiet, steady narrowing of the distance between us. I stood, though I couldn't have explained why. He stood too. The space between us was small, smaller than it had been before, and there was no buffer this time, no drawer to fix, no shelf to move, no coffee cup to hand over. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, so full it felt like it might spill over. When he stepped closer, I didn't move away. And then we crossed that last line. We spent the night together. The words sound simple when written, blunt almost. But there was nothing simple about that night, not the way it unfolded, not the way the house felt different, not the way my own body felt like something both foreign and familiar. When it was over, the room seemed too still. The rain had stopped, and the quiet pressed in, heavy and absolute. I sat by the window, knees pulled up, staring out into the dark. The street was empty, the pavement shining under the thin glow of a streetlight. My thoughts weren't clear, they were fragments, flashes, questions that didn't have answers. I thought of my husband. I thought of myself. I thought of the line we'd crossed and how there was no erasing it, no pretending we could go back. He was quiet. I was quiet. The whole house was quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. The clock ticked on the wall, a sound I'd heard every day, but that night it sounded different, sharp, deliberate, almost accusatory. I couldn't tell how long I sat there, only that by the time I moved, the sky outside had begun to pale with the first hints of morning. My hands shook when I reached for the curtains. We had spent the night together. And in the hollow quiet of dawn, the weight of that truth felt almost too heavy to hold. The morning after, I woke with a start, as if I'd overslept for something urgent, even though there was nowhere to be and nothing pressing on the calendar. The room was quiet, but the quiet felt different, heavier, like it carried a memory we couldn't put away. The light outside was pale, a washed-out gray that made the walls seem colder than they were. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from a night that hadn't been restful. The air felt thick around me, full of things I didn't have words for. My thoughts weren't sentences, they were fragments, flashes, his hands, his breath, the silence afterward. The silence was the loudest of all. The first thing I noticed when I looked around the room was how normal everything looked. The chair in the corner, the folded blanket on the armrest, the clock ticking softly on the wall, none of it betrayed what had happened, and somehow that felt worse. The world hadn't shifted to reflect the way I felt. Everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. He was quiet, moving in another part of the house. I could hear faint sounds, a drawer opening, the scrape of a chair. Ordinary sounds, but I couldn't hear them as ordinary anymore. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, stared at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back didn't look dramatically different, but she wasn't the same either. Her expression was harder to read, her eyes shadowed in a way that had nothing to do with makeup. I didn't linger. Downstairs, the kitchen felt like a test. The hum of the refrigerator, the clatter of a spoon against a mug, small, familiar noises, were suddenly sharp. I moved carefully, methodically making coffee, pouring water, trying to keep my hands from shaking. He came into the kitchen without fanfare, without hesitation. He carried the same calmness he always did, but it wasn't the same calm anymore. It was quieter, heavier, as if it was covering something neither of us knew how to name. Our eyes met briefly when I handed him a cup. The look wasn't long enough to mean anything, but it wasn't short enough to mean nothing. We spoke very little. The words we did use were ordinary, about the weather, about whether we needed more bread, about the tools still left out from yesterday, but beneath every word was the unspoken weight of last night. I moved through the day as if on autopilot, but every step, every task, felt deliberate. I picked up laundry, folded it, put it away, all while feeling that steady hum of unease. Every time I walked into a room and he was there, my chest tightened. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of the way I felt around him now. My phone rang once in the afternoon. It was my husband. His voice was steady, familiar, the same voice I'd heard for years. He asked if I needed anything from the store since he'd be staying late again. I said no, thanked him, hung up. I stood there for a long time after the call ended, staring at the phone as if it could offer me clarity. It didn't. The hours moved slowly, but the tension didn't ease. The rain from the day before had stopped, leaving behind a wet shine on the windows that caught the fading light. The house felt strange, like it belonged to someone else now, or maybe like I didn't belong in it the way I used to. I kept waiting for something, an apology, a conversation, an unraveling. But nothing came. He didn't bring it up, and neither did I. Instead, the day passed in fragments. I caught him watching me once, just for a second, before he looked away. I found myself studying the way his hands moved when he fixed a loose hinge, focusing on that because it was easier than thinking about anything else. I sat on the couch in the late afternoon, a book open on my lap, the words swimming together unread. He walked past, the sound of his steps loud in the stillness. Dinner time came, and I made it without thinking too much, chopping vegetables, stirring a pot, setting plates. He helped in quiet ways, holding things steady, passing me what I needed without asking. Our hands touched once when I reached for the salt. Neither of us pulled away quickly. After dinner, I washed the dishes slowly, my hands submerged in warm water, the suds clinging to my wrists. I stayed there longer than I needed to, staring at the bubbles, listening to the muffled sounds behind me. The night felt longer than the day had. I sat by the window as darkness filled the street outside. The street light flickered once, then held steady. I thought about what had happened. I thought about the woman I had been before last night and the woman I was now. They didn't feel like the same person, but they didn't feel entirely different either. It was unsettling, the realization that you can change and stay the same all at once. The quiet stretched. He passed by the living room once, glanced in, didn't say anything. And I just sat there, my hand resting on the window frame, my thoughts circling, my chest heavy with the awareness that there was no undoing what had been done. The night ended the same way it had begun, quietly, without drama. But I knew, even as I turned off the light, that nothing about that day, or the night before, was ordinary. I knew that no matter how careful I tried to be, the balance we had destroyed couldn't be put back. The morning after felt heavier than the others, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because the night before hadn't brought clarity or peace, only a thicker silence that hung over the house like fog. I woke before the sun rose, my eyes snapping open as if my body knew I wouldn't sleep much longer anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint with my eyes like they might spell out an answer. My husband was home now. He had come in late, quietly, like always. There had been no questions, no searching glance, no hint that he sensed anything beneath the surface. He'd placed his briefcase by the door, muttered something about being tired, and gone straight to bed. And yet, just knowing he was there again, the weight of his presence in the house, shifted something inside me. It made everything feel sharper, more precarious, like I was standing on glass that could shatter with one wrong move. When I slipped out of bed and into the kitchen, my hands were already trembling. I poured coffee, wiped the counters, busied myself with movements so ordinary they almost felt ridiculous. But they gave me something to do, a reason to avoid thinking too much about what had happened and what couldn't be undone. He came in, the other he. He didn't look different, but to me he did. His calmness unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I couldn't tell what he was feeling. Did he regret last night? Did he wish it hadn't happened? Or worse, did he wish it had happened sooner? We didn't speak at first. The silence wasn't empty, it was tense, thick, like a room holding its breath. When we did speak, the words were painfully ordinary. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I answered, my voice sounding flat to my own ears. I reached for a plate, my fingers brushing his when he passed it to me. It was the lightest touch, but it sent a jolt through me. Every touch now felt magnified, like even the smallest contact echoed louder than it should. The hours dragged that day. My husband had meetings, calls, endless tasks that kept him out of sight but not out of mind. His voice drifted from his office down the hall, steady, familiar, a reminder that the world hadn't stopped for what we'd done. I spent the morning cleaning things that didn't need to be cleaned, folding things that didn't need folding, anything to keep my hands moving. The air between us was careful, too careful. I could feel him being cautious, the same way I was being cautious, both of us moving around the house like people stepping around broken glass. Around midday, my husband came into the kitchen for coffee. For a few moments, everything felt almost normal. He asked about lunch, I mentioned soup, and he nodded absently before disappearing back into his work. The door clicked shut behind him, and the quiet settled again. I could feel his eyes on me, the other him, just for a second, before he turned away. That single glance felt like a confession neither of us would voice. The afternoon stretched. The hours blurred. I heard the sound of tools in another room, the scrape of a chair, the faint hum of a song he hummed under his breath. Every noise reminded me he was there, and every reminder made my pulse race a little faster. At one point, we ended up in the hallway at the same time, both moving toward the kitchen. The space felt too small, the air too thick. Our shoulders brushed lightly as we passed, and I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly once I reached the kitchen, as if I'd been underwater. By the time evening came, the house felt like it had been holding its own tension all day. My husband emerged from his office, tired but not suspicious, asking about dinner like nothing had changed. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked faintly, and the silence filled all the space words couldn't. When the dishes were done, he went back to his office for a call, leaving the rest of the house in dim light. I found myself standing by the window again, my reflection faint in the glass, the outside world shadowed and still. Behind me, I heard a step, a single, steady step that made me stiffen. He didn't come closer. He didn't speak. But I could feel the weight of his presence, like a shadow that didn't need to touch me to be felt. I thought about saying something, anything, but no words formed. The night closed in slowly, the air thick, the quiet unbroken. I sat in the living room for a long time after, the lamp casting a pale circle of light over the coffee table. I thought about the past nights, about the lines we'd crossed, and about how many more lines there were left to cross, and whether any of them mattered now. When I finally turned out the light, the darkness felt too sharp. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step careful, as if even the sound of my feet might give something away. By the time I closed my bedroom door, my chest felt heavy, my breath unsteady. My husband was already asleep. I stood there for a long time, listening to his breathing, and wondered how I had let my life slide into this space between two worlds, one where nothing had changed, and one where nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning began in a strange kind of stillness, one that wasn't quite peaceful. It wasn't the clean, soft stillness of a quiet morning. It was heavy, like a room after someone has said something they can't take back. I woke before dawn again, staring at the ceiling as the faint light started to creep in, listening to the sounds of the house, the refrigerator humming, a branch scratching lightly against the window, the low creak of the floor when I shifted my weight. My husband was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow, steady. I stared at him for a long time, trying to feel something familiar. There had been a time when looking at him had made me feel grounded, safe, certain. But now, I couldn't read my own emotions when I looked at him. There was a hollow ache, and under it, a fear I didn't want to name. Fear of what I had done, fear of what I hadn't yet faced, fear of the moment it would all unravel. I moved carefully, sliding out of bed, making sure not to wake him. I padded down the stairs, each step deliberate. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The kitchen was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into you, even as you wrap your hands around a coffee mug. I poured water into the kettle and stood there, staring at the steam, feeling the weight of everything pressing in. I could hear him, the other him, upstairs. His steps were steady as always, but now even that sound felt like a signal. I didn't want to turn toward it. I didn't want to face what those footsteps meant. I kept my eyes on the mug as I poured coffee, focusing on the tiny ripples of liquid as though they could anchor me. They didn't. When he finally came into the kitchen, it wasn't loud or sudden. He walked in the way he always did, calm, quiet. But it didn't feel like the same walk anymore. We didn't speak right away. We didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words could have. I handed him a cup, my fingers brushing his for half a second. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't deliberate either. It was just something that happened, something that carried too much weight for such a small gesture. I wanted to ask him if he regretted what had happened. I wanted to ask him if he felt what I felt, the heaviness, the guilt, the pull. But I didn't. The words stayed locked behind my teeth. The day moved in fragments. I tried to clean the kitchen, wiping down surfaces that didn't need it. I folded laundry, stacked plates, did anything that gave my hands something to do. It didn't help. Every room felt smaller. Every glance felt longer. Every silence felt louder. I heard my husband's voice later that morning as he called from his office upstairs, asking for a file he'd left in his bag. His voice was normal, steady, even, and the normality of it almost broke me. Because there was nothing normal about how I felt. The hours passed slowly, and with each one the weight in my chest didn't lift. It settled. It stayed. In the afternoon, the weather turned. The clouds shifted, the light dimmed, and the whole house took on that muted tone that made every corner feel heavy. I caught him watching me once, across the room. It wasn't a long look. It wasn't bold. But it landed like a question I didn't know how to answer. When my husband came into the kitchen later, I felt the air change again. He asked about dinner, about whether there was enough bread for tomorrow. I nodded, answered in a voice that sounded too calm, too even. I watched him pour himself coffee, watched him move around the kitchen, and all I could think about was the divide between what he believed and what I knew. I spent most of that evening moving slowly, as though every action mattered too much. I stirred soup, set the table, cleared the dishes, all with hands that felt heavier than they should. When my husband went back upstairs for another call, the house fell quiet again. The quiet was unbearable. I sat in the living room, the light dim, my hands wrapped around a cup I didn't drink from. I stared at the window, watching the faint reflection of my own face. I thought about how it had started, just a simple request for a massage. I thought about every line we'd crossed since then. I thought about the woman I had been before and the woman I was now, and how there was no clear line between them anymore. The night dragged on. I heard my husband moving upstairs, his voice low as he ended his call. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I stayed where I was, still unmoving, my fingers gripping the mug like it could hold me together. The house felt like it was full of secrets, like the walls themselves were holding everything we weren't saying. By the time I went upstairs, my body felt heavy, my breath uneven. My husband was already asleep again. I stood at the doorway for a long time before slipping into the room, the quiet pressing around me. I lay down beside him and stared at the ceiling, my eyes open long after the room went dark. There was no undoing anything. There was no pretending it hadn't happened. And as the clock ticked into the night, I realized something I'd been avoiding, the story I had been telling myself, that I could control this, that I could stop it, wasn't true anymore. It hadn't been true for a long time.
Bye bye.